So, apart from your distinguished career as a journalist, you're also one of the essential Twitter commentators for those of our persuasion. Along with AC Grayling and Joe Morm QC, Ian's one of the guys who will cheer you up every single morning and amuse you late into the night with his Twitter spats. And politics.co.uk, I don't know if you visit it ever, is a site prominent in the new generation of sources that have almost overnight replaced traditional media in setting the news agenda and breaking the big stories. And of course, he's the author of this extraordinary book, which I would say was the weapon of choice if you're going to start a discussion, because we're Remainers, we don't have arguments, let alone rows. If you're going to start a discussion on this topic, a prescient, prophetic, and profoundly disturbing book, which begins with a prediction of what Britain is going to look like on the 1st of April 2019. The book was a sellout success, as we know. It's just gone into a new edition. And when I asked him what it had to do to update it, he said basically he simply had to change stuff that was in the future tense into the present tense. He lists 24 named experts. This is a man who clearly can't get enough of experts. And 19 pages of references. So this is a highly authoritative work. So, why did you write this book, Ian?
Well, I was asked to. So
best reason.
Indeed, yes. There's this sort of thing of like show don't tell in the way that you do a lot of work like this. And the book actually has a message that isn't said at any point. I'm sorry, I'm talking to you, but I have to keep on facing forwards because of this microphone.
Face forwards, face forwards.
So it has a message that is at no point said, and that message is what experts say matters. They have some impression of how things will operate if you pick particular pathways. What experts say on trade, on law, on the way that your economy is organized, these things matter. And they are a kind of way of expressing your sense of patriotism. Because patriotism isn't really about feeling. There's a sort of thing that it's a sort of a love affair. But you don't proceed on that basis by just thinking, I'm going to keep on thumping my chest and shouting that Britain is the best, Britain is the best. You think, how do we improve the lives of people in this country? And if that's what you think, you take very careful stock of what experts say about how you proceed on any given pathway. So the book was really intended to sort of have almost none of my voice in it, or to take myself out of it as much as possible, and just provide a way of taking a lot of expertise of people who, frankly, don't always talk in the clearest way because they're so fully immersed in their subject, and being able to transmit that in a readable, pretty easy to read sort of format to a wider public.
And how did you write it? I mean, this is the question that I always sneer at when people ask me, but how long did it take you?
It took 6 weeks. So it was horrific, actually. It's like the worst 6 weeks of my life. And it was sort of defined like how awful it was. I remember my friends were down the pub, and they sort of said, they sent me a text, do you want to come? And I just thought, no, because I've got to learn about fish stocks and the regulatory arrangements for how we operate them. And I just thought, my life has come to a very bleak, low point to have reached this. So it's 6 weeks of basically just, you talk an awful lot to an awful lot of very, very clever people. And then you just try to organize it into some kind of readable assessment. You just churn it out after 6 weeks. Anyone that's written any kind of major project, you just need to just puke it out. Just get it out, basically. And once there's something on the page, there's something to work with there. But that thing that they tell you, I mean, you know much better than I do, that it's basically like giving birth. I mean, I do not know what that is like, I accept. But nevertheless, it was a genuinely painful, traumatic experience writing a book in 6 weeks, especially on this kind of subject matter. And especially, of course, where things kept on changing as I was writing it. So halfway through, Theresa May came out and did her conference speech. And at the beginning, I just thought, well, that's, sort of thrown everything into disarray. If you remember, actually, up until that point, she hadn't actually said what she was going to do. It wasn't until months after that in Lancaster House that she actually used the words single market and customs union. For months on end, we were playing this baffling game of sort of Cluedo, of trying to, decode the words that she was using and what that actually meant in policy terms. So all the while, the world was changing while you were doing all the sort of research. It was very, very unpleasant. I never want to have to write another book as long as I live.
And how long did it take, actually, from the day you sat down to write it to the day the books were shipped?
Oh, I'm not sure. I think there's probably about sort of 6 weeks after it was done where it has to be all we put together and comes out. I have a very small publisher, so we can work much quicker than someone like Penguin, where you've got much longer lead-in times. It takes a lot longer.
Yes. And so the picture you paint is dystopian. It's, if this goes as badly as it could, the country will be slowly dying in an ugly, toxic mix of poverty, legal chaos, and paralyzed trade. The only thing that will be doing well is the red tape. And the book's full of jaw-dropping, throwaway statements like, even some larger domestic banks will struggle through, which implies that many of the smaller domestic banks will not struggle through. So what's the worst thing that can happen now?
It's the same thing that has always been the case, which is basically that you leave on the 31st of March with no deal. And no deal means no deal. You may have noticed in recent weeks, David Davis has done this game where he talks about basically like a deal, no deal, where what he's really getting at is we're not going to have done anything on trading arrangements, but we're going to sort out all this administrative stuff. Now, that is not on offer. It has never been on offer. Anything that is in the deal is in that withdrawal treaty that is going to be signed by Davis and Barnier, if indeed there is anything to sign. And that then goes to the European Parliament, and we've discovered this week to our Parliament as well in the form of primary legislation. Anything is in that deal. Anything and everything is a very, very broad phrase in this regard. If you take what happens with aviation, it is very, very difficult to perceive a viable aviation industry functioning at even half of its current capacity if there's no deal, if we're out of open skies. If you take what goes on with Euratom, there are no legal arrangements for how we are going to be sent the nuclear material that we use in radiotherapy, unless that is in the deal. If you take what would happen with tariffs, with country of origin checks, with mutual recognition, with legal recognition, for instance, if someone works in one country, whether their qualifications are recognized, whether it's a dentist or a hairdresser or anything else, if none of that is agreed, there is no deal. And that is, I would suggest, at the beginning I used to say, this is the kind of thing that would make Suez, it's not even, to even talk about things like Suez, it's just, we're well beyond that point. It would be, without doubt, a moment of profound, crushing humiliation for this country, and one which would make all of us much, much poorer, and the poorest of us worst affected of all. And that is the worst case scenario. I still do not believe that it is likely, although I have to say, a lot of very sensible people do think that it is over 50% likely at this stage. Lots of people in Brussels who have now almost completely lost faith with any kind of basic competence of the British team also believe that that now looks like it's more than 50-50 the case. And that's partly because they're dealing with negotiators who don't seem to understand the fundamental dynamics of the system in which they operate. And they are also dealing with people who have told them one thing, who have then gone into bilateral meetings with other members of the EU and told them something else, and have then retreated on both things when they've then gone into another round of meetings with Barnier and his guys. They are at this stage pretty much lost all hope of getting through to them. The messages coming out from David Davis suggest that he still does not understand the severity of the repercussions of the current course of action that he has adopted. So it cannot be ruled out. However, I have to say, I've never really believed that we would end up with no deal. I just can't conceive that this, an advanced country, would get to that stage. And, the business end of this is really the last 6 months, where it's a reality rather than something that is projected far away. That a country like this would actually do that, would inflict that kind of punishment on itself. That seems inconceivable to me, and it still seems inconceivable to me. I have to say, I still don't believe that that's what's going to happen. But that is the worst case outcome, and it is, without a doubt, the direction in which we are currently heading in.
So,
it's going to be really upbeat later on, by the way. There's jokes and...
Now, one of the parts of the book that I thought was most interesting was when you analysed the statements that Theresa May had made about her view of how this was going to pan out. And you suggest that from the outset, she was working on what they're calling a hard Brexit, and that was always her choice. Am I fair? Is that...
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there was this language right at the beginning, if you remember. She used to say things like, freedom of movement won't continue the way that it has done until now. And every minister would attach that to the end of their sentence whenever they said freedom of movement, in the way it has worked up until now. Which sort of suggested, freedom of movement is a core part of the single market. If you're going to stay in the single market, you have to keep freedom of movement. But there is room for reforming it. You can sell that in any way you like domestically. There's plenty of things we could do. I mean, the most obvious one is to do what almost anyone in Europe does and put a quite strict 3-month limit on people that come. So you've got to have a job or you have to have the means of sustaining yourself, or else you do have to go. And that has been, that's there in the treaties. It's been well established by European case law. One of the cases came out when, David Cameron was doing his negotiation and he bafflingly failed to use it in the press to show that free movement is not some kind of total anarchy. Actually, there are quite a few requirements people need to fulfill. I thought for a moment that maybe she was hedging her bets in those first few months, that the fact that she kept on using that phrase suggested maybe she was thinking, we'll keep the options open. But as soon as she gave her conference speech, it was very, very clear what she talked about. She brought up several things. One of the things she said, look, we're going to end free movement, we're going to end jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, which is just, is the kind of red line she has imposed that has so radically limited her room to maneuver. She couldn't have done her opponents' jobs for them more effectively if she'd tried by making that promise. And then the final part was she said, well, we're going to decide how we label our products, our food products, which was just a completely bizarre point to have made, but also quite a revealing one, because nobody decides that. You can leave everything. You can leave the customs union, you can leave the single market, but at the WTO, they have quite strict rules on how you label your food. Now, a few years ago, we had a scandal, a sort of tabloid, right-wing tabloid frenzy about the use of the Union Jack on packets of meat. They took off the Union Jack and, the Sun went completely bonkers. And that was all blamed on Brussels. Actually, that wasn't a Brussels regulation at all. That was a WTO regulation that came from the Codex. But nobody knows what the Codex is. Nobody knows really anything about the WTO. So as that was passed down and passed through the EU, everyone made it about Brussels. Now, when we leave the EU, if we leave the EU, we will follow all of those rules just the same as we would when we were in Brussels, but they won't get to blame it on Brussels, so who knows who they'll blame it on. The madman in the WTO may be the next sort of attack object for the right-wing press. Now, when she gave that speech, it suddenly became clear a couple of things. The first one was that those 3 commitments on freedom of movement, on European Court of Justice, and on food labelling meant that she had to pursue a very hard form of Brexit. She had to leave the customs union. She had to leave the single market. And once you're doing that, the economic effects of this country are very, very severe. You can make it, less drastic by expanding the time and getting some decent negotiating capacity in there. But nevertheless, there's no other way of saying it. You're cutting yourself off from your largest market. Nobody does that without there being severe repercussions. But it also, I thought, was more revealing in an emotional kind of way, that it sort of showed who is she pitching her messages to right now. And plainly, she was pitching her messages to the right wing of the Conservative Party, a wing of the party that is now in a state of outright lunacy, frankly. I mean, they've completely gone into a sort of tribal, almost, I think, sort of quasi-religious sort of attitude towards the project, where your commitment to it, your faith in it, supersedes any other quality that you might have. As you can see, of course, when Priti Patel left the Department for International Development. And suddenly you have Ian Duncan Smith going around the TV studio saying the person to replace her has to be a Brexiter. You think, well, how fascinating. I mean, someone might have even thought that maybe they should be someone who knew about international development. But that is of absolutely no consequence whatsoever. What's of consequence is the fact that you really, really, really believe in Brexit, and that view that if you just believe in it hard enough, it'll be okay. And the corollary to that, the sort of side point to it, is this sort of idea of don't ask too many questions. Because, to do that is to exhibit insufficient faith in the project. So the real act of being critical, or of dialogue, really, or of engagement in the complications that it entails, has been almost completely ignored. And was ignored for a long time. I mean, David Davis used to, he'd have trade bodies come in to talk to him, and the civil servants, before they walked in the room, would say, be positive. The first thing you've got to go in there and say is, Brexit's full of opportunities. Then later on, you can introduce what your concerns are. But if you don't go in there saying it's full of opportunities, he's basically going to ask you to leave in 5 minutes. So it can be no surprise when then months later, David Davis is still making extremely rudimentary errors about the nature of EU law because he had closed out anyone who was of any critical appraisal whatsoever from being able to inform him of the difference. So probably in truth, she was always a hard Brexiter. But she kept it pretty sly for the first sort of 3 or 4 months, kept her options open in the background, and it wasn't really until that conference speech that the severity and sort of the fundamentalism of how the government was going to proceed really became clear.
And of course, having stormed into that conference with rhetoric which I seem to remember from watching The World at War, and it wasn't on the British side. Word for word in some cases. Of course, she then calls a snap election and manages to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Do you think that when she accepted this job, which, let's be honest, it was the most toxic poison chalice in British history, when she picked it up, do you think she knew how bad it was going to be?
No, I don't think so. At the beginning, I thought she was an adult in a child's world by that stage. If you think back to that, Gove trying to stab Boris just being this human shambles, Andrea Leadsom going on about everyone's children, bonkers. And then Theresa May came in, and I disliked her intensely from her time at the Home Office. She ran it catastrophically badly, was given credit for having survived, which you just sort of think, at which point did our standards in British politics become so low that just not being sacked is considered being a victory in a job? But really, the department was catastrophically disorganized, which is, an easy thing to say from the outside. I mean, when you're in it, just sucked into that Kafkaesque nightmare. That's, your husband who you can't live with, your kid growing up without their mother because you're separated, or someone being trapped in a detention center who's never been put on trial and won't know how long it is until they're let out. I mean, the Home Office sucks up people's lives into this churning machine of ineptitude, and often they stay there for years at a time. She did nothing to fix that system, and in fact was really quite cruel in the way that she proceeded. There was also some very interesting stuff that would always be told to you by, for instance, the guys around Vince Cable when they're in coalition, or who would sort of say, well, look, we obviously want the student numbers taken out of the immigration stats. Everyone was pushing for that to take place. Pretty much everyone agreed, bar none. So they came to her with the economics and said, look, foreign students, really valuable for the economy, really good for the country. There's no downside. There's no public support for getting rid of foreign students at all. I mean, huge public support for keeping them. And she didn't care. She didn't care about the economics at all. She didn't care about the public mood at all. Because Theresa May, to my mind, is a true believer on immigration. Not like David Davis, not like Boris Johnson, not even like Liam Fox, none of the others really are true believers. They parrot it, they say it because they think that's the bit you've got to do, but they don't really believe it. David Cameron said all this unspeakable nonsense about tens of thousands, but never implemented any policies that might pursue it. He never thought for a second that he was interested in pursuing it. He was just, the standard used car salesman that he always was. Theresa May really believes in this stuff, and she doesn't really care about the economic consequences of it. So I think that was, that was clear. I really disliked her for it, in terms of competence, but also morally. I thought she was a moral threat to the country. But I did think she was a grown-up, and I did think she was smart and canny. I thought she played a blinder during the referendum, doing just enough to stay in the game, assuming it was Remain. Everybody assumed it was Remain. And then afterwards, during the Tory leadership, Shakespearean bloodbath, she was sensible enough to just step back and let them just stab each other to death, and then she could just walk over the tops of the corpses, all of which demonstrated smartness. But there does come a point where you've got to say, you know what, maybe she isn't that smart. And we've got to be there now. I mean, she's had a year. She's making the most elementary mistakes. Even if you look at the most recent effort, this I mean, it's hard to come up with the words for just how unspeakably foolish it really is. This idea of using an amendment to the repeal bill to put the date of Brexit into British legislation. That is, I mean, it's exactly the kind of thing that someone would do to you if they were your utter enemy and decided you had to be destroyed. And she is inflicting it upon herself and calling it a form of liberation. Now, you can see why, the elements of the press and of the Tory party she's trying to galvanise. But even there, you just think you are making your own life harder. It's not your successor. It's not even the country. It's your own life that's going to be made more difficult by this. In trade deals, the thing that negotiators always tell you is there's always something people forget. It's like, when you go on holiday and you left the keys, as soon as you get to the airport, you remember that you left the keys under the bed. There's always some tiny little bit that you forgot. And it'll be tiny. It won't be something that people think about. It's something on patent law, on plant patent rights or something. Or there's, for instance, with the way that we organise the information that is sent on passengers when they're flying to the US. Now, that's under an EU umbrella. We give the information to the US. If a plane has not given that information before it takes off, it cannot take off to go to the US. Now, that's not a difficult thing to fix. You basically just get a piece of paper, you sign it, go, now Britain's going to do that instead of the EU, and it can be done. But if you forget to do it, then you can't have any of your planes taking off to go to the US on April the 1st, March 30th, whatever it is. That's why you build flexibility into the phasing in of trade arrangements. It might just be 3 weeks, it might be 2 days, or it might be, much more likely, about 7 years that we need to try and sort this stuff out, as we go through those negotiations. What you don't do is limit your own options by insisting on a date that does absolutely nothing to improve your own strategic advantage, but does massively assist your opponent in holding you over a barrel and getting exactly what they want from you. But that is what she has done. And so I have to say, after this sort of strategic error after strategic error after strategic error and a consistent inability to grasp what is required of her, I have grudgingly reached the point of accepting that maybe she is just an idiot.
Well, that's quite uncharacteristically strongly worded for you.
Yes, indeed.
I have to say that this is a very temperate and reasonable book. There's this nice little paragraph here. What's the context? The Brexit ministers are operating in an environment that is much more complicated and restrictive than they imagine. They are being forced into an impossible timetable by an overmighty negotiating partner while fighting numerous legal cases, facing a hostile parliament with a slim majority, and trying to establish a society-wide regulatory framework. And all this is happening against a backdrop of falling economic confidence and growing international concern. You haven't quoted anyone using an expression such as thick as mince. You say that Fox and Davis have an inability to grasp the rudiments of the EU, supported by Eurosceptic tabloids who don't recognise the complexity of their predicament. Just a side point here. If you did a word search on the manuscript for this, for the word complexity, how many times do you think it would come up?
Yes, no, rather a lot.
Yes, rather a lot. Almost every page, actually.
I can imagine.
But seriously, who does? Who gets this enough to be able to go into this negotiation with any credibility? Is there anyone on the Leave side who isn't intellectually challenged?
Yeah, there's quite a few. They're not really in the cabinet table, and I accept that there has been this sort of tribal, this frenzy, as I sort of spoke about earlier. But there are some people, I think, especially if you look at Liberal Leave with a capital L, which is a sort of loose conglomeration of various people who, some of them have been working on this stuff for a long time, and mostly wanted to sort of stay. I mean, the classic case of it is Flexit, which is this sort of website. It's really worth reading. If you want to reaffirm your faith that some people in the Leave camp are not, completely cut off from evidence and are interested in stuff, is absolutely worth reading. It's stuff by a family called North. It's a father and the son. They've been working on this stuff for ages. They're emotionally pretty weird, I have to say, and they're quite vicious and aggressive. So I wouldn't advise you follow them on Twitter or see anything about how they conduct themselves in life. But their academic work is of high quality. People very often can separate those parts of their personality. It's not uncommon, I don't think. And it's worth looking at, these people who have plans for how we can stay in the single market for the long term. Some people on the Liberal Leave had ideas that they sort of thought, maybe we can make this work for everybody. Maybe, you could have Britain in this sort of outer ring of Europe, countries that want a looser, more sort of transactional relationship with Europe, and you'd have the Eurozone, which consolidates inwards, as Macron and Merkel are doing right now. That would be a much more political union. And that could work for people like Macron and Merkel, because if things really go wrong in the Eurozone, and we shouldn't be too complacent just because economic performance in the Eurozone is strong right now, lots of economists look with considerable unease at what is going on in Italy. And, if Italy falls apart, it's very hard to imagine that stuff working out. It's not like Greece. You can't let Italy fail. It's too big. You could easily just start plunging money into that situation. The Eurozone, I think, still remains quite a dangerous project. And it's useful for the fail-safe for everyone to have these outer rings of Europe, various options that could be falling back on, as some kind of insurance policy. I think there's some good work that has been done there. There's many other names I could mention. I have to say, most of these guys didn't stand up when it was needed of them. I remember after January, I was writing pieces of saying to Remainers, look, if you can say that you can accept soft Brexit on single market and customs union, there's guys that should be able to come and say, look, we reject the May stuff, it's crazy, we can make this work together. And there was a lot of interest from Remainers and absolutely none from the people who'd been expressing these kind of ideas, for decades in some cases. They really fell back on that kind of tribalism. However, in recent months, I've seen them start to come back out again. And more people, some of them from Leave, who are just saying, look, this is just nuts, and this is being done badly, and I don't want my name associated with this, so I would now support Remain. And some, who basically have just gone back to saying that same old thing, like, look, we've got to stay in the single market and the customs union, ideally, and we need a soft Brexit, and who are prepared to make that claim again. So I'm not going to suggest that there have been smart people who've been entirely consistent, because most of them haven't. I have to say, when it really mattered, they buckled. But nevertheless, they are out there now, there are voices out there now, and there are some perfectly credible, intelligent people in Leave. It is a minority. It's a slim minority, I have to confess that. But they are there.
Good. Well, good. What about on the Remain side? Any white knights buckling up, ready to ride in and save the day?
No. So, people are worried about this, and I don't really think that this is necessarily a problem. So it's, there's this unfortunate sort of thing that we've got to where everyone that comes up for Remain is basically a former politician. So it's Nick Clegg and Tony Blair, and you say these names, and those are very divisive names, and you're not going to be organising any kind of mass mobilisation around those names, even though, I really like Nick Clegg and Tony Blair, not so much, but still, he's a very accomplished political performer. I just don't see the lack of one figure for Remain to be such an issue. I don't see the lack of one message for Remain to be such an issue. And actually what I think Remain should do in the crucial year to come, and the more and more I look at the year to come, I think that there really are options that could stop this thing in its track or extend it to the point of meaninglessness, more likely on the second option. That actually we should take a leaf out of what the Leave campaign did during the referendum, which is political journalists like me looked when there was a split in Leave, and there were the two camps, Leave.eu and Vote Leave. Vote Leave was the sort of broadly respectable Boris Gove stuff, and Leave.eu with kind of lunatic, hard-right, UKIP fringe, nativist stuff. And that looked catastrophic, right? I mean, you're used to political journalism, you always think a political party that's split loses an election. That's how that works. However, that's not how it worked for them. For them, it worked very well indeed. For conservative voters, small c and big C, who were concerned about economic stuff, but actually instinctively felt like they didn't want to be in the EU, they heard the message from Michael Gove, and especially from Boris Johnson, which, as well as in terms of what they said, but also just tonally, reassured them that this was not some kind of, crackpot extremist project, which, as a matter of fact, it completely was, but nevertheless. And then on the other side, for the roughly 25% of the population who are implacably opposed to immigration and don't really think about anything else and just are that sort of hard anti-immigration part of the population, they got the rest of the message. And that's how they built a very broad coalition made up of people from, council estates in the north, in post-industrial towns, to the golf clubs in the shires in the south, an impossible coalition of interest, which you could never satisfy. I mean, there is no way of satisfying that range of economic interests. How do they do it? By having a multi-pronged communication strategy that was entirely incoherent in terms of what the messages were. I mean, internally, it made no sense at all, but it didn't need to. You just put out those messages and you targeted different bits of the electorate. Now, I believe that Remain can do that same thing. And it can do it, to my mind, some of the saddest stuff I see is when I see Remainers fighting with each other. You know, some people opt for soft Brexit, others want to opt for just reversing the whole thing. I do not see that there should be any fights between those two groups. That seems to be completely counterproductive. There are more than enough enemies out there for people to be targeting without having to fight with each other. The same with when some people think we need a second referendum to reverse it. Others think it can just be done in Westminster again. I don't see any reason for people to be fighting each other over that. When people want to make an offer on immigration, as Tony Blair came out and did the other day, I can pretty much assess how effective that offer is by how uncomfortable it makes me feel. I don't like him saying that stuff. I think it's a nonsense. I think it's mostly made up, the stuff that we say about immigration. And in fact, reducing immigration would be catastrophic economically to this country and very, very bad for those at the lower income levels who most depend on public services, which we would struggle to fund without having a certain amount of people of working age coming here to help our more elderly population. Nevertheless, I see that Tony Blair saying that can be a key part of the Remain agenda, of saying here is an offer on immigration, and all this stuff over here looks rather scary. Whereas people like me want to make more of a sort of full-throated story, a narrative, to say actually this is not a correct course for us as a country. We should be an open, tolerant society based on evidence and reason. That's where we want to go. We can have that multi-pronged attack, and that really involves not having too much of a leadership structure in place and these various groups working without too much coordination between them. That, to me, does not seem like a particularly unhealthy place for us to be. And in these quite tumultuous political times when demographics and loyalties and political instincts are suddenly changing, it's probably quite a canny way for us to organise. So I think we should just stop worrying about the fact that there are no leaders.
So that's a very interesting point, because one of the things that this situation has thrown up is a tremendous shift in the political landscape. Yeah. You have come to the conclusion in the book that this was a vote on which politics trumps economics. You've written about the economy sacrificed on the altar of Brexit and the end of the myth that the economy will always be safe with the Tories. Nobody believes that anymore. These are profound shifts in the political landscape, aren't they? I mean, today we've had John Redwood sticking it to the Daily Telegraph. Who would have thought?
Anymore. Look, I mean, how else to put it? Like the CBI and the TUC are sending out joint press releases. And that's insane. It's just insane. And of course, as a government, you should think if the CBI and the TUC have gotten together to tell you not to do something, don't do it. You know, it's clearly not a good policy. So part of the shift is about trust, and I think that lies ultimately, you've got to go back to Iraq with that, of just a fundamental severing of the trust of the population in government. You also look at things like the financial crisis, severing trust with the way the economy operates, with the idea that it's even vaguely fair, phone hacking, severing trust with the way that the media operates and the reliability of the press. Not that there was that much trust in them in the first place, but nevertheless it got rid of any dwindling bits. And the MP's expenses scandal, which is the same thing for the political establishment. So we have had moment after moment after moment of just cutting away trust in what authorities and institutions and sort of senior figures say. And then the financial crisis creates the kind of material condition of want and of need that gives that kind of engine, that thrust to that kind of form of suspicion. So then you get guys coming out with stuff. It doesn't matter whether it's the IMF or it could be any number of economic think tanks, whether it's the Office of Budget Responsibility or the Treasury or the AECR, and people don't believe them. And, I mean, some of that is presentational, that, you know, it's very difficult when they say, you know, when you get Christina Lagarde or someone coming out and going, look, it's going to be absolute chaos if you vote Brexit. Oh, and by the way, it's going to cost you specifically £261 per family. You sort of think, well, you know, it can't be both of those things. If you've got that precise a number, then it certainly won't be complete chaos. So some of it is about the way that we present economic information. truth is, lots of the economic assessments that were done have proved to be pretty accurate. The one thing that wasn't was the idea we would suddenly shoot into recession, but that was based on the idea that the Bank of England wouldn't suddenly flood the economy with money, specifically to prevent that outcome. And then the unspeakable sort of hypocrisy of watching Brexiters criticize the Bank of England and sing that there hasn't been a recession because of specifically the things that the Bank of England did to prevent the recession that they would have created if they pursued their agenda is actually quite hard to swallow an awful lot of the time. But nevertheless, there was a severing of trust there. I think that trust can be won back. And I think that there is a process that is now underway, that is underway right now, where people are seeing the reality of what economics is in their life. Now, sterling fell immediately after the vote. It plummeted again when Theresa May confirmed that we were going to be leaving the single market. Inflation continues to rise. What that means is that after a period where from 2008 we had wages falling behind prices, people were getting poorer in real terms, we had 2 years where that had stopped being the case, 2 golden years of suddenly people actually being able to afford more than they had before, and then Brexit came and it severed it once again. Now, people are right now poorer than they were before. Food is costing them more. Travel overseas is costing them an awful lot more. Any kind of import, like a laptop or anything, is costing them a damn sight more than it was before. People are getting poorer in their real lives, and the actual effects of Brexit are being felt. That is a slow process, and you can't necessarily connect the effects that happen in people's lives to the person that they blame it on. But nevertheless, that is an economic condition that is happening right now. It can be taken, it can be demonstrated that this stuff is real, that it is really taking place. And we can reaffirm a greater sense of causation and empiricism to the way that people think about politics, so that it is a fundamentally more rational process and less of a sort of tribal, emotional one, which it has been really for the last sort of year and a half.
Okay. So I've got one more question for you, because then we're going to open up to the floor. Politics are never going to be the same again, and for you that's a good thing, ultimately. Britain is never going to be the same again. A few weeks ago, in The Guardian, Carol Cadwalader wrote, "In a well-functioning democracy, a well-functioning press and a well-functioning parliament would help a well-functioning judiciary do its job. Britain is not that country." I never thought I'd see that sentiment expressed. And a few days later, the departing London bureau chief of the New York Times wrote an article that went viral. I expect many of you read it, headed "Nobody Knows What Britain Is Anymore." So, is this a terminal decline? Are we ever going to see again John Major's Britain of warm beer, cricket matches, old maids on bicycles, but also, I know, we laughed at the time, but it was such an innocent time compared. Also, that was a Britain of fairness, of decency, of tolerance, of institutions that more or less functioned. Has that gone forever?
No. We are about to have a rough patch. I've outlined what a no deal would look like, and that really is really severe. And it's hard to overstate how severe that would be and what kind of political things would follow from it. You know, there's no way of knowing if that goes left, if it goes right. It's quite easy to imagine a kind of Donald Trump-like populist in the sort of Farage mold, blaming immigrants again for the sudden poverty that people would feel. There is a broader fight, which is even if you get longer time frames for this stuff, and realistically, if you're going to leave the single market and the customs union, you're going to need at least 7 years of transition just to fix in your trading deal, just to get it into place. So imagine that we have that hard Brexit, but done to a credible timetable. Then a whole other thing takes place, which is really the battle around the cabinet table for what kind of a Britain this is in terms of its standards. Because the truth is, if you want to trade with Europe in a frictionless way, you accept their rules. That's how that works. That is not some great tyranny from Brussels. That is simply the statement of the customer decides how they want the product. Okay? It's as simple as that. If you want it to trade without being checked on the border, that means you're signing up to the way the Europeans do things. So you've basically become a colony of Europe. Now that's the least bad option. The more severe option in this account is something really like what Liam Fox and Boris Johnson is trying to achieve, which is to go to the Americans, secure much lower standards via a trade deal there. You would block yourself off from Europe, but you would be forced to start searching in these other markets overseas. And that would involve basically, you know, the sort of Singaporeization of Britain. Low standards, zero tariffs, flooding your domestic market with very cheap food and cheap manufacturing goods, because you'd unilaterally reduce all of your tariffs, but of course devastating your local producers who make things in this country. You'd devastate agriculture, devastate manufacturing. You'd pretty much get rid of steel, because it wouldn't be able to compete with Chinese cheap steel that would be dumped here. And again, that is a very fundamental shift in the way that British society operates. All of these economic situations would be bad, but there is another one, which is that Brexit doesn't happen, or that you can find some kind of transitional arrangement on current terms that fossilizes into a new status quo. Now, that would keep us in pretty much where we are right now, but it would still take a long time for this country to regain its international reputation, and I think it would take a long time for the divisions between families and between friends and between sort of broad groups within this country that have suddenly emerged to be healed. This terrible idea that there's a sort of division by virtue of education, and a division by virtue of age, and a division by virtue of urban areas versus rural areas. Those kind of ideas that we're basically two countries in one, that'll take a much longer time to heal. So it has to be said, it's very hard to see a very easy solution for us in the years to come. But right now, the quality of our opponents is so low, the variables are so severe and widespread, their authority over power is so limited that I just believe that this is something that can be won. Now, that still takes a price. It would still look pretty humiliating for us to retreat back to Europe. I mean, it's not going to look, none of this is good. There are no good outcomes here. But there are opportunities for us to limit the bad, limit how severe it is, limit how long it takes. And I think that is still up to Remainers as they campaign and they debate and they fight for what they believe in. So that can be done, and it can limit the damage, and it doesn't need to be the absolute nightmare that it currently appears to be when you switch on the evening news.
That's really good to hear. Thank you, Ian. Thanks. Right.